scars still, and he served as one of Lincoln's chief foreign policy advisors at the time of the Civil War. Zachariah Chandler of Michigan had amassed a fortune in real estate, dry goods, and had been one of the founders of the Republican Party. Elected to the Senate in 1857, he had engaged in very bitter disputes over slavery on the frontier, pleading with his colleagues not to surrender another inch of territory to slaveholders. When Southerners in the Senate itself brandished pistols and bowie knives and threatened to murder Republicans, this is our Congress, Chandler took up calisthenics and improved his marksmanship in case he had to fight. What does it say? Once Civil War began, he demanded that the government suppress what he called the armed traders in the South with all-out warfare. Senator Benjamin Franklin Wade of Ohio. He was blunt, and he was irascible, and he was called Bluff Ben because of his willingness to duel with slaveholders. Once the war began, he was determined that he and the Congress should have an equal voice with Lincoln in shaping war policies. Wade hated slavery, as Sumner and Chandler did, and promised Southern secessionists that the first blast of Civil War will be a death warrant to your institution of slavery. These three senators headed a faction called the More Advanced Republicans by the Detroit Post and Tribune. Members of this group were really progressive 19th century liberals who wanted to bring the nation into line with the Declaration of Independence and its promise by ridding it of slavery. Before the war, they advocated their party's hands-off policy just like Lincoln did. But once the war began, their constitutional scruples sort of fell by the wayside. And that brought them to a significant difference with the moderate and more conservative members of their party. They respected the president and had voted for him, and now they urged him to destroy slavery as a war measure, pointing out that what would maim and cripple the Confederacy was to do away with slavery. Sumner flatly asserted that slavery and the rebellion were mated and would stand or fall together. They also reminded Lincoln that slavery had caused the war, was the reason the Southern states had seceded, and was now the cornerstone of the Confederacy. It was absurd, they said, to fight a war without removing the thing that had caused it to come about. Should the South return to the Union with slavery intact, as Lincoln wanted, they said, Southerners would just start another war over slavery whenever they felt it threatened again. So the current struggle in that case would have accomplished nothing. If Lincoln really wanted to save the Union, they said, he must tear out slavery root and branch. And Sumner, as I mentioned, was a major Lincoln advisor on foreign affairs. He linked emancipation to foreign policy. There is a strong possibility Britain and possibly France would recognize the Confederacy. If they recognize it as an independent nation, that would be an international problem. But, said Sumner, if Lincoln made destruction of slavery a Union war aim, he was sure that Britain would balk at recognizing the Confederacy. Why? Because emancipation because Britain was proud of her anti-slavery traditions. But also Sumner reminded Lincoln, emancipation would break the chains of several million oppressed people in the United States and right America with her own ideals. Lincoln and his party could no longer wait for time to eradicate slavery. Frederick Douglass, I'm sure you know. The abolitionists belabored the point also. They wrote Lincoln, they petitioned him, they addressed him from the stump, and in their newspapers they descended on the White House one after another, and they did their best to convert the president. Foremost among them, of course, was Frederick Douglass, the most eminent Negro of his generation. And from the outset, Douglass said that the end of slavery was in the war, and he mounted a one-man crusade to win Lincoln to the idea. He thundered at the president and played on his personal feelings about slavery. He said, the mission of this war is the destruction of bondage as well as the salvation of the Union. The Negro is the key to the situation, the pivot upon which the whole rebellion turns. And, he said, the pressure on Lincoln became unrelenting. Inept generals, mounting military failures, and growing war weariness in the North plagued Lincoln. Enlistments were down. You need more men. You need the slaves, the abolitionists argued. On that score, the slaves themselves were contributing mightily to the pressures on Lincoln to emancipate them. They didn't sit around and wait for Lincoln to free them. They were leaving rebel farms and plantations and escaping to Union lines by the thousands. This in turn, by the way, caused a tangle of legal problems for Lincoln and his administration, but Lincoln did not shirk that duty, and he aided mightily in the slaves' self-liberation. At first, Lincoln resisted a presidential mandate to move against slavery because he said, Lincoln's words, "We didn't go into this war to put down slavery, but to put the flag back, and to act differently at this moment would, I have no doubt, not only weaken our cause, but smack of bad faith. The thunderbolt will keep," meaning the thunderbolt of emancipation. In short, Lincoln was accountable to the whole country, and the vast majority of whites were adamantly opposed to emancipation. Still, Lincoln was sympathetic to the arguments that Sumner and his associates were making, and he personally hated slavery. So he tried something short of a sweeping Emancipation Proclamation, because he still considered that what he called too big a lick. But he seemed to still be caught in his impossible dilemma. And I'm going to read this slowly because I want it to sink in all that Lincoln had to deal with. He was caught in his impossible dilemma. How to remove the cause of the war, how to keep Britain out of the conflict, how to solve the Negro refugee problem, how to cripple the Confederacy and suppress the rebellion, and yet retain the allegiance of Northern Democrats in the crucial border states. How do you do that? Hoping for a solution that would meet all these aims, in March 1862, he proposed what he called gradual emancipation. And some people are very critical of Lincoln for proposing this. He thought if he could get the border states to agree to gradual emancipation, and he would sponsor a colonization program, that he thought maybe Northern whites would agree to an emancipation policy, because Northern whites did not want all those freed Negroes coming north. But the plan was short-lived because border states representatives flatly refused to do it. And it's at this point, I think, that Lincoln came to the understanding that we have to make emancipation a war aim. In the House of Representatives, the leader of the advanced Republicans was 39-year-old Thaddeus Stevens, who controlled the nation's purse strings. He was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He had a very cutting wit. He once said, "I now yield the floor to Mr. Brown, who will make a few feeble remarks." I don't want to mess with this guy. One Republican journalist called Stevens, quote, "the master spirit of every aggressive movement in Congress to overthrow the rebellion and slavery." And with Stevens' guidance and over Democratic protests, a series of anti-slavery measures were passed through Congress, and Lincoln was delighted to sign them. And Frederick Douglass, was delighted as well. I won't go through all his quotes, but he was quite happy, and said that, among other things, the war Lincoln said, "It's a duty on our part now to liberate the slaves. The time has come to take a bold new path and throw Union armies at the heart of the rebellion." Lincoln said Southerners could not throw off the Constitution and then at the same time invoke it to protect slavery. They had started the war and they must face the consequences. So Lincoln decided to go ahead and issue an Emancipation Proclamation. Secretary of State William Seward, Lincoln wanted to do it right away, but Secretary Seward said to him, We need to wait for a northern victory, and there have been very few northern victories up to this point in the war. So he and some of Lincoln's other cabinet members told him to hold off. He said, if we issue the Emancipation now, it will seem, quote, our last shriek on the retreat. And so Lincoln held off. And while he was waiting, he published this very famous open letter to Horace Greeley of the New York Tribune. And I know you heard part of this letter, and I am always asked about it. This is a letter that is persistently misunderstood and misrepresented. In it, Lincoln wrote, my paramount objective in this struggle is to save the Union, and not either to save or destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some of the slaves and leaving others alone, I would do that also. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. Few people who have brought these words up to me have noted Lincoln's concluding remarks, however. In closing, Lincoln wrote, I have here stated my purpose according to my view of official duty, and I intended no modification of my self-expressed personal wish that men everywhere could be free. Lincoln had little choice but to speak of slavery strictly in terms of preserving the Union, because that was what the Northern public would understand and accept. Though often referred to as a stalemate, the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862, Lincoln counted as a success, because General McClellan here was, Horace Greeley skipped him. Okay, General McClellan was able to get leave to leave the battlefield. So Lincoln called it a success and issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Frederick Douglass, for one, could not restrain his ecstasy. We shout for joy that we live to record this righteous deed, he said. The advanced Republicans were also delighted, but the proclamation would prove to be a disaster for the fall midterm elections in Lincoln's party, because already the Northern Democrats were upset with Lincoln for his harsh war measures, and now Negro emancipation was more than they could stand. They stumped the Northern states in building fears and warning that massive influxes of Southern blacks would invade the North. Sullen, war-weary, and racially charged Northern voters dealt Lincoln's party a smashing blow in the North's 5 most populous states, all of which had gone for Lincoln in 1860. Now they returned Democratic majorities to Capitol Hill. So while the Republicans barely held on to control of Congress, the future looked bleak for the presidential election of 1864 and Lincoln's re-election. Lincoln told a Kentucky delegation that he knew the Emancipation Proclamation was a major factor in the Republicans' defeat at midterm, but that he would, quote, rather die than retract one word of it. In December, amidst the rising racial protests against him, Lincoln asked Congress and the country to support his moves against slavery. He said, fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. You'll recognize this, I'm sure. The fiery trial through which we pass will lay us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. In giving freedom to the slave, we assure freedom for the free. Honorable alike in what we give and what we preserve. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last vessel of earth. We see this as one of Lincoln's some of his greatest words. But that message provoked a firestorm of abuse from congressional Democrats who blasted Lincoln's projected Emancipation Proclamation as blatantly unconstitutional and predicted it would lead to an upheaval of the whole social order and bring about the prospect of, quote, crime, blood, and ruin, and fill every patriotic heart with astonishment, terror, and indignation. Still, on New Year's Day, 1863, Lincoln officially signed the Emancipation Proclamation. By war's end, all 3.5 million slaves in the defeated Confederacy could claim their freedom. The proclamation opened the Army to black volunteers, and in all, some 186,000 Negro troops served in Union forces. It's doubtful we could have won the war without them. Lincoln would work out a refugee system to try to ease the effects of emancipation, but even so, it became the most explosive and unpopular act of his presidency. And by the mid part of 1863, thousands of Democrats were in open revolt against his administration. They denounced him as an abolitionist dictator who had surrendered to radicalism. In the Midwest, Democrats launched a peace movement to, quote, throw the shrieking abolitionist faction out of office and negotiate a peace treaty that would somehow restore the Union with slavery intact. And there were anti-war rallies against what they called Lincoln's War for Slave Liberation. There were, race rest, I'm forgetting to count. Okay. Back one. Okay, thank you, Mr. Train Ride. Okay. A couple more pages, I know you guys are getting tired of hearing my voice. In 1863, race and draft riots flared up in several northern cities, and a good number of Union troops refused to continue with their enlistments. Some of them just deserted and left. They said they had enlisted to save the Union. They didn't wish to risk their lives to liberate Negroes. In 1863 in New York, over 100 Negroes were murdered, many of them women and children. Even an orphanage was attacked. And so even conservative Republicans pleaded with the president to abandon his emancipation policy and save the country from what they called the brink of ruin. But Lincoln was intractable. He could be slow and deliberate in making up his mind, but once he made it, he was not going to budge. He stood firm in his resolve. He had made up his mind to smash the safe society of the South and eliminate the moral wrong of slavery, Negro bondage, and no amount of public discontent was going to change his mind. Now, you can see that the political pressures on Lincoln were massive. When I was at the Library of Congress a couple weeks ago, and I was able to see those letters that I talked about, this is one that I had not heard about in the past. Some of the things I saw I knew about, but this is a new letter. This is a letter called the Booth Letter, and it was written by Lincoln to Senator Charles Sumner. And it brings to mind some of those unusual challenges that Lincoln had in dealing with black troops. Lincoln's writing this letter of introduction on behalf of a Mrs. Booth. Her husband, Major Lionel Booth, was a white officer in charge of black troops. Those black troops had been slaughtered at the Battle of Fort Pillow. At that point, Southern soldiers refused to take defeated black Union soldiers as prisoners. So instead of doing that, they slaughtered them when they were trying to surrender. And that's why it's often called the Fort Pillow Massacre. Mrs. Booth's husband had been killed by a sniper before that last part happened, but still she went to Lincoln and she said that she felt that black troops were not being treated equitably. She wanted black troops that her husband had been in command of. She wanted them to have the same benefits that the wives and children of slain white officers had. Now you would think this is something that would have been normally done, but you have to remember, Negro marriages had no basis in law. And so what he's doing in this letter, he's asking Sumner to please listen and listen to Mrs. Booth and see if they can do something to make marriages, in fact, equal to marriages in law. And I think this says something about Lincoln's personality. And the one other Lincoln letter that I want to show you before I wrap it up is the Hodges letter. This is the first page of it. And it's one of those letters I was shown at the Library of Congress by Michelle. And it's a letter from Lincoln to a man named Albert G. Hodges, and it was written in April of 1864. It's about a conversation Lincoln had with three Kentuckians, Governor Thomas Bramlett, Hodges, and a former Senator Archibald Dixon. Hodges was the editor of the Frankfort Commonwealth, a newspaper, and he asked Lincoln for a summary of their conversation. And this letter impressed me because it offers an excellent glimpse into Lincoln's thinking about his constitutional responsibilities and why he changed his position on emancipation. Over the years, I've had a number of people, lots of people, who support the Confederate view of things say to me that Lincoln was wrong in not letting the Southern states secede, because Lincoln took an oath to preserve the Constitution. He did not take an oath to preserve the Union. Here are Lincoln's thoughts on that matter in his own words. There's some excerpts from the letter. My dear sir, you asked me to put in writing the substance of what I verbally said the other day in your presence to Governor Bramlett and Senator Dixon. It was about as follows. I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not think so and feel. And yet I have never understood that the presidency conferred upon me an unrestricted right to act officially upon this judgment and feeling. It was in the oath I took that I would, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. I could not take the office without taking the oath. Nor was it my view that I might take an oath to get power and break the oath in using the power. I understood, too, that in ordinary civil administration, this oath even forbade me to practically indulge my primary abstract judgment on the moral question of slavery. I have publicly declared this many times and in many ways, and I aver that to this day I have done no official act in mere deference to my abstract judgment and feelings on slavery. I did understand, however, that my oath to preserve the Constitution to the best of my ability imposed upon me the duty of preserving, by every indispensable means, that government, that nation, of which the Constitution was the organic law. Was it possible to lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution? By general law, life and limb must be protected. Yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life, but a life is never wisely given to save a limb. I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. Right or wrong, I assumed this ground and now avow it. I could not feel that, to the best of my ability, I had even tried to preserve the Constitution. If, to save slavery or any other minor matter, I should permit the wreck of the government, country, and Constitution altogether. Lincoln, nearly up to the brink of the election, was afraid he would not win. I think I mentioned. Politically and militarily, things were bleak for him in 1864. Political rivals were in ascent, military losses, war weariness. Lincoln's advisors were telling him re-election was an impossibility, and Lincoln did not need to be told how bad the situation was. It was in this context this next little amazing piece of Lincoln memorabilia I bring up. I saw this at the Library of Congress, and it's quite amazing. There's one little short memorandum here. This is called Lincoln's Blind Memorandum. He wrote it on August 23rd, 1864, against that backdrop. This morning, as for some days past, it seems exceedingly probable that this administration will not be reelected. Then it will be my duty to so cooperate with the President-elect as to save the Union between the election and the inauguration, as he will have secured his election on such ground that he cannot possibly save it afterwards. A. Lincoln. Lincoln folded this memorandum and pasted it closed, so the text inside could not be read. Then he took this memorandum to his cabinet members and had them sign on the outside of the memo, sight unseen, which they did, so it came to be called Lincoln's Blind Memorandum. And you can see the signatures there: William Seward, Secretary of State; Pleasanton, Treasury; Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War; Edward Bates, Attorney General; Gideon Wells, Secretary of the Navy; and John P. Usher, Secretary of the Interior. And Michelle said to me, either they thought he was joking or they had that much trust in him that they turned that over and signed it without realizing what was inside. I'm sure they came to know later. But the significance of it was that whatever the verdict of the people would be that November, Lincoln pledged to help save the Union should even he not be elected, affirming his belief in our democratic system. Well, luckily, and this is my last slide, luckily for you, luckily Lincoln, the tide turned for Lincoln. There were some key Union victories, and he was able to win the election in 1864. Even though it was Union victories that really caused this to happen, and not his emancipation policy, he took it as a mandate for him to continue in his fight for true emancipation. Even before Lincoln issued his Emancipation Proclamation, he was afraid that it might be nullified in the courts or overturned by a future administration or Congress. So in December of 1862, he asked Congress to adopt an Emancipation Amendment. And if any of you saw the movie on Lincoln a few years back, that's the crux of the movie. In April 1864, it was adopted by the Senate, but it could not muster enough votes to pass the Senate. And so over the winter of 1864-65, Lincoln put tremendous pressure on the House of Representatives. He pulled out all the stops. And he made the Republican Party make it a part of their re-election platform. And with all that pressure, finally, on January 31st, 1865, the House adopted the present 13th Amendment by just 3 votes more than the required 2/3 majority. Lincoln pronounced the amendment a great moral victory. And when it was ratified by the states, which was done in December of 1865 after Lincoln's death, the amendment would end human bondage everywhere in America. The Emancipation Proclamation did something for Lincoln personally, I think, that many people don't think about. Because in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, he also liberated himself. For in the process of granting freedom to the slaves, he emancipated himself from his old dilemma. The proclamation brought the private public Lincoln together. Now the public statesman could obliterate a wicked thing the private citizen had always hated. Now the public statesman could destroy what he regarded as a cruel wrong that had always stained America's experiment in popular government. I think Lincoln hoped to make the country conceived in 1775, physically and morally whole, in April of 1865. That same April, after giving a speech heard by his assassin, which Lincoln spoke favorably of Lincoln Negro suffrage, a radical idea at the time, Lincoln would give up his life for that hope. So I think you can see the politics of slavery, as Michelle said to me, is quite complicated. It's easy to say, if Lincoln was anti-slavery, why didn't he just free the slaves? If only it had been that simple. Anyway, sorry about my call. Thank you. Oh, any questions?